The suitors retired for the evening to their own houses. Odysseus and Telemachus clear the hall of weapons, as Athena carries a golden lamp to light their way. Odysseus is harassed by the maid-servant Melantho, and Melantho is warned by both Odysseus the beggar and Penelope that judgment is coming. Odysseus sits down with Penelope, and the two begin to trade carefully crafted responses. Odysseus, still disguised as a beggar, spins a falsehood for his wife about his history, which includes that he had met Odysseus. Penelope tests the beggar by asking about Odysseus's clothing, which Odysseus is easily able to answer. Odysseus, the beggar, tells Penelope her husband is alive and returning soon. Penelope, skeptical of the claim, arranges for the old maid, Eurycleia, to wash Odysseus's feet. Eurycleia recognizes Odysseus due to his scar, and we hear the story of how Odysseus received his name. Odysseus threatens Eurycleia, his old wet nurse, into silence. The book ends with Odysseus interpreting a dream for Penelope, and Penelope tells Odysseus the beggar how she intends to test the suitors. Welcome to Ascend the Great Books podcast. We're very happy that you're with us today to discuss book 19 of Homer's The Odyssey. Please check out our website, thegreatbookspodcast.com, where we have a question-answer guide on the Odyssey that can help you in your studies and also in your small group. You can also follow us on Twitter or X or whatever we're supposed to be calling it now. And yes, also today we have a wonderful guest with us. So we have Mary Pat Donoghue, who serves as the Executive Director of the Secretariat of the Catholic Education for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. Welcome.
Oh, thank you, Deacon. I'm very, very happy to join you this evening.
Yeah, people talk about me having a really long title because I'm Chancellor and General Counsel, but yours has me beat. That is a wonderful title, Executive Director of the Secretariat of Catholic Education for the USCCB. That is wonderful. What does one do as that director of the Secretariat?
Yeah, that's right. Well, I will say one thing about the length of that title. There is a saying in DC that the longer your title, the less important you are. So this is good. Humility check. My main role is to provide staff support to the 8 bishops that comprise the Committee on Catholic Education, which is currently chaired by Bishop Thomas Daly of Spokane. Great champion of Catholic education, a former Catholic school teacher and principal himself, our president, and he, sets forth, he and his bishops, 7 bishops that work with him, set forth a vision. And really my job as staff is to enact that, to execute that, to communicate it out, and then to brief the bishops likewise on what's happening on the ground, really throughout the country.
No, that's wonderful. And you take calls, from deacons in certain dioceses who are calling to ask you questions. I think I've had recourse to your office about half a dozen times.
I absolutely do. My line is always open for deacons and others.
No, that's good. We deeply appreciate your ministry. I know we've benefited from it here in Tulsa. So you got your start, maybe not your start, but how I first heard about you was St. Jerome Academy, which I think has become somewhat famous in the classical school world. Can you just kind of give us the brief history of St. Jerome?
Sure. Yeah, it's interesting. St. Jerome's was a very typical parochial school. It was founded in 1943, and it was staffed for many, many years by the Sisters of Notre Dame de Namur. And along around 2009-10, it had fallen on very hard times. A decade of declining enrollment, a growing sense among the younger families in the parish, many of whom were choosing to homeschool, that the sense of those families was that the importance of Catholic education went without question, but they didn't believe that the education that was being offered in the school was as closely aligned to the church's understanding as it could be. And that was a little bit of a surprise to me. I think a lot of people make the assumption that when families homeschool, they're assessing your religious program and finding it wanting. And in this case, what I found was maybe a bit of that, But at a deeper level, the richness of the curriculum itself was in question.
Hmm.
So it was an opportunity to reimagine the school. And that's essentially what happened. So Father Jim Stack, my pastor, permitted me to convene a committee. I had the blessings of being so close to the Catholic University. And they wrote an original plan for St. Jerome Academy, which is very much steeped in an integrated humanities. It's a historical framework with a strong emphasis on literature and how literature integrates and illuminates about a particular time period or a particular people. And so it's a very fundamental part of that program. And it was an important thing for me. I did not get the benefit of this type of education myself. So I was getting this along with my students, which is quite an adventure.
I was going to ask, like, did you, so when you talk about the integrated, is that the same or at least somewhat analogous to classical or liberal arts school?
Yeah, so I would say we tend to call it liberal arts simply because that encompasses also the pedagogy that aligns so closely and so well. So it is a framework of historical basis with the integrated humanities, the restoration of the trivium, especially grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and again an emphasis on high quality literature intended to illumine some truth or aspect of history, of the church, of culture, of life.
Well, St. Jerome seems to just have created this blueprint, right? It's like ubiquitous in all these conversations about getting these struggling Catholic schools up and running again. And in a lot of ways, I think we look at St. Jerome, where we have our new classical school. It was founded by St. Catherine Drexel 100 years ago.
Wow.
Similar story, right? It's struggling, down to 80 students, et cetera. What could we do? Put a committee together. Let's go classical, first classical Catholic school in the diocese. And now it's booming, right? And it is. It's a lot of the young families that are driving that. And you're correct. It's not just the Catholic identity, which I think is incredibly important and drew a lot of people, but also just like a very robust classical liberal arts education, most of which is coming from young adults like myself, who actually would really have wanted that type of education growing up and didn't receive it. And now I keep telling my daughter, like, she's coming home and she's like, Dad, I learned this prayer to get in Latin. Let's say it together. I'm like, I don't actually know that prayer. Right. And this is like dumbfounding to her. She's like, you're older than me and you're a deacon. And I was like, okay, so here's the thing. I am trying to give you the education, right, that I did not receive. Right? I don't want you just to grow up and be as smart as I am. I want you to grow up and be smarter than I am, right? You're going to know all these things. I didn't know who Odysseus was I don't know, I was probably in college or something, right? I didn't know I told her the other day when we were doing the Baltimore Catechism that, like, I don't think I even knew what the cardinal virtues were until I was like a sophomore in college. And then her mind is just like, right? So for you then, where do the great books fit into that? Because I feel like the great books sometimes are a lifeline for those of us who didn't have classical education that are trying to kind of reboot our own formation.
Yeah, no question about it. The school's motto is Discamus Permanentia, which translates to let us learn the abiding things. And so there was a very conscious decision to include the great text or the intermediate versions that could help students later on access the actual text. And that was because these books do contain some eternal principle, right? They've lasted. They enlighten about the human condition. We understand that knowledge never develops in a vacuum. It's always built upon a foundation. And these were the works that reflected and guided the building of Christendom, which is our own culture and the culture that we want to preserve for our kids. And so the intention to include them was ordered not so much just because they're old and sometimes there's a thought with schools like this, oh, you have a fetish for old things. No, we have a fetish for truth and for goodness and for beauty. And these are very, very well presented and preserved in the great books. And I also think there's a bonus, which is, and even with the Greek text, even a pre-incarnational culture still has an imagination that is consistent with that pursuit of truth that's fundamental to a Catholic imagination or a sacramental imagination, if you will. And I think that's why they are super important and necessary, really, for the formation of young Catholic kids to receive the great truths of the faith. All of these together, all of these truths, the literary truths, the truths of faith, of course, cohering ultimately in Christ, who is Logos.
Yeah, no, I very much agree with all of that. I think that, we're blessed in the Diocese of Tulsa that our diaconate program now has a great book sequence. So I'm
It's wonderful.
currently teaching the Iliad to our new diaconate candidates. And so this is one of the questions, right? Originally is like, why are we going to read Homer? Why do we need to do this? Why do I need to learn about this guy getting speared in the face, right? How this going to help me be a deacon? And really, it's been interesting to watch them kind of unfurl a bit in those conversations and flourish, where they kind of see like, oh, this is where a lot of those nascent conversations about human nature and God actually start, right?
Yeah.
Like this is where, because we're having these conversations of like, what is the relationship between Zeus and fate, right? So we're trying to figure out like divine providence. What's the relationship between Zeus and the free will of man? Like, does anyone in this book actually have free will, right? That's a question. That's a question the church is going to take up too. What does it mean to be a good man? What's arete? Like, what does it mean to be an excellent human according to Homer? And so I think a lot of these conversations, you have to kind of meet them where they are, right? They're incipient. They're just beginning in Homer. But I tend to have a very robust understanding of Homer, the teacher, and that he's really trying to teach us about human nature, and that there are lessons here that I think we can learn. And I think you can learn them whether you're, in your 50s and going through a diaconate program for the first time. I don't think we have a class of, 19. I think we have 2 that have even read it before.
Yeah, that doesn't at all surprise me, especially that's my age cohort, which meant put us in elementary school in the 70s and high school in the 80s. And it was a time in which much of these texts were not taken up. I think what's interesting too, though, when we think about this, there is sort of our modern tendency to think about the usefulness of something, the utility. How will this help me? We grew up asking that question. When education properly understood really is formative. So it's a question of actually in some way bringing about a conversion or a growth of in your own intellect and soul, right? Which is just by its own virtue a good thing.
Right.
And that was something that I came to understand in my time at St. Jerome's. The Stratford Caldecott calls it an excessively activist culture that educates for doing and not for being. And yet, being is the essence of childhood and really of life and of God himself. So anyway, that's
no, I agree. I think that too. I think one thing that I've noticed now, because I'm a convert, so it's interesting to raise children where I was not raised Catholic. And so I'm trying to offer them a culture, right, that I didn't receive. And then also in a classical setting, one of the things that, and you've already mentioned this, that we talk about why you read the great books. Well, like, why do we start with Homer? Why not like Confucius or the Enuma Elish or something like this? It's like, well, you take, particularly in a Catholic context, you take Christ, right, the Logos incarnate, as your guidepost. And so then you're like, okay, well, you look at, obviously we have the Old Testament leading into the New Testament, but that river isn't just isolated from everything else. You actually have this whole Hellenistic tradition that comes together and kind of flows into the Hebrew tradition just prior to Christ. Sometimes, Pope Benedict talks about this, sometimes in really violent ways, like we see in Maccabees, but also in a lot of ways that are actually mutually beneficial. And we see a lot of the Old Testament books written during that time period that you can tell are very much being influenced by Hellenistic thought. And then all that comes together under Roman order, and this is what St. Paul talks about as the fullness of time, right? And what I've realized is that same picture of providence cultivating the world for the coming of Christ is the same thing that tends to happen in a child's imagination. And what I mean by that is like, these things have to start small. So we get Homer, we get these kind of nascent conversations, we get these very interesting things that are happening on. And it's filled with lots of other things that kind of get the imagination up and running and thinking about some of these things. And that's what I've noticed is that sometimes we kind of forget you kind of have to prep a child's imagination for the gospel. Like, are they even used to thinking about these things? Are they used to thinking even deeply?
That's right.
If they just sit in front of a screen all day, like, is it going to zap their ability to actually contemplate? And so now, my oldest is not old enough to read Iliad or the Odyssey, but I bought these. It sounds lame, but I bought these graphic novels that
No, that's not
are
lame at all.
actually really good. Like the
Yeah.
art's really good, and then I read it to her, or she read it, and typical thing, they read it in like one evening, and I'm like, okay, let's go back and read it slowly. So then I read it aloud to her. It was like, because we read together each night, and it actually tracks really closely to the narrative. And the Iliad one is, it does make a lot of gratuitous use of people getting speared. So there is that. And then I bought her the Odyssey one, which also was somewhat charming. It did necessitate a few edits, where I think the artist got too excited about Calypso and Circe and a few of the other characters. I was like, yeah, you don't need to be looking at this. But it's interesting just to me that like how her mind can grasp things at her age, and how that's kind of tilling the soil for later, deeper concepts, which is in a certain way what Providence did to the world as a whole.
Absolutely. I think that is one aspect of it. I think even something as simple as having them learn to look closely and deeply at things, to draw them carefully, to look for pattern and order, not just in literature, in nature and in other things, but all of this is intended to develop those faculties that are innate. I think, one thing that modern education gets wrong is it just fundamentally doesn't understand the human person. So it doesn't understand this sense in which, it's God himself who has created the human person with these faculties. And those of us, certainly parent as primary educator or teacher, are cultivating and nourishing and nurturing something. And so you're looking for opportunities, just like you did, to be able to begin that process. We did a lot of that at St. Jerome's too, using the wanderings of Odysseus as a storybook in first grade. Certainly not Homer himself, but,
right.
And cutting out Calypso and
we gotta wait till at least third grade, right?
Exactly.
No,
but even Grimm's fairy tales do the same thing, and people kind of blanch at that because they can be, quite stark themselves.
Yeah, I realized I had to read the Grimm's fairy tales before I read them out loud, because sometimes they get a little brutal.
Yep.
Yeah, well, I think what you just demonstrated too is the relationship between the great books and that classical education. Because with the great books, like, you're reading these particular books, and I think there's a lot of things that adults can benefit from that. I think even the intention of the great books was, hey, our education as a whole is kind of being deprived of these perennial truths. We need to kind of reboot them or supplement them. But then I think what you just demonstrated is that the classical education is so much thicker than that, right? It's so much more robust than just like read these correct books or read them in chronological order. But it's like, well, wait, yeah, how do you draw, or how do we approach grammar, or how do we do these things, just because kind of continue to cultivate the imagination? And that's something I've just kind of, I'm a student too when it comes to classical education, and it's something that I've grown in my appreciation of.
Sure, me too. I'm right there with you.
Okay, so before we jump into the text, because I could talk to you about this all day long, because I just find it fascinating. Now, keep in mind, in our year of Homer, we're only at book 19, and we have a lot of first-time readers. But I do have to ask, are you, like, do you favor the Iliad, or do you favor the Odyssey? Like, which one do you like more?
I have to confess that I haven't read the Iliad closely. I've read, I know parts of it, but the Odyssey is the text that I know better, in part because it has come up more frequently in our curriculum. So right now, I would have to say the Odyssey, but I need to go back and look at the Iliad a little more.
I think that makes sense to me. I think the Odyssey would lend itself more to, I think, probably a classical education in younger kids, because my daughter read, she read these kind of graphic novels, and we talked about them. And I think that, the Iliad, that's fine, but there's a lot of subtleties there between Achilles and Hector and et cetera, that I think you have to be somewhat older to appreciate. You don't have to be that, old to appreciate, like, Odysseus and a Cyclops, right? Yeah. Or all the mythological creatures, or like, halfway into the book, you're just already ready for, like, okay, here comes the next island. What terrible thing is going to happen on this island?
That's right.
So that makes sense to me that would be more approachable to a younger audience. Even though I will say that when I'm around young men and like freshmen in high school that have to read the Iliad, I think it really keeps them engaged. That about every 16 lines, someone gets speared or dies in a terrible way. It seems to keep them engaged.
Yeah, it's war. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
That's good. Okay, let's look at the text. Let's look at book 19. Fagles entitles this Penelope and her guest. So we start off here. We've kind of been waiting because we had Dr. Zimmerer on, and he helped us with the last couple books. And we were told that, Penelope wanted to meet with the beggar, which of course then, like, we just saw this big entrance of Odysseus the beggar into his home. So he's returned home, even though kind of in this, secretive way. And then we're like, oh yeah, he's going to get to meet Penelope face to face. And then we kind of had this whole interlude of the beggars go out and fight and do these things. And so we're finally trying to get to Odysseus and Penelope meeting, which we get in this book. So the text starts off with all the suitors have gone home. And so it's just them inside the home. And Odysseus has all these lines about Odysseus and Athena plotting destruction, for the suitors. And they're going to go hide all the weapons. So, the way I read this is like, the walls, they've got weapons up in decor and stuff like this and around, and they've got to go hide all these. So when they kind of, set their trap, the suitors can't really defend themselves. What really stood out to me here, though, is, Eurycleia. I mean, poor Eurycleia, like, she keeps trying to help, and they don't really want her help too much. She offers to carry the torch for them. And Telemachus says, no, we'll actually put this beggar to work, right? He can carry the torch. And then Telemachus and Odysseus start taking down the weapons, and Athena comes in. And she lights up the whole, like, it says she's lifting a golden lamp and cast a dazzling radiance roundabout. It's like line 35 or so.
Mm-hmm.
Telemachus can't see her, right? He doesn't know where the light comes from. He intuits that it must be a god. And Odysseus somewhat chastises him and just says, get a grip on yourself, etc. When I first read this, it struck me, like, the first time I read the Odyssey, as like, what a mundane role. Like, why is Athena coming down and like holding the light for them while they're like doing this chore, right? That Eurycleia, the maid, the old maid, could have done probably quite easily. And on the read through this time, it kind of dawned on me, or at least where I was wanting to go with it, is that this seems to be an analog, right? Like, they're both in the dark. They're both trying to get this job done. They need help with the suitors. He needs help, and here comes Athena as their light, just to enlighten the entire palace. So I kind of grew in my appreciation of this reading by kind of pushing maybe into a more allegorical read of it. I don't know. What do you think?
No, I think that makes some sense. I mean, Athena has been in and out of the narrative up to this point, nudging and creating conditions, which I think is consistent with Greek gods. I think it's interesting that Telemachus can't necessarily perceive her, but he perceives the effect of her and immediately cries out, "There must be a god here!" And Odysseus just squelches that, which is kind of interesting. He and Athena have had this, working relationship as she's helped him get out of jams, and It's almost like he wants to keep it that way for a bit longer.
It is, yeah. They have we've talked about this on the podcast before, that they have a very intimate relationship, particularly for a mortal and an immortal, and one that, we haven't seen, a sexual component to, but it's the way that we described it previously, the way it's kind of the working definition of it I have in my head, is that Athena looks at Odysseus and sees herself, right? Which is somewhat characteristic of a Greek god, because they tend to be imploded and narcissistic. But, he loves, or she loves him, I think, because of the reflection that he provides back, right? Because that's what they both complement one another. And when he's on the beach, they're like, no, we're both, these, cunning minds. We both are these old hands at intrigue, etc. But I think in a certain way, we see this in this book, is that cascades down to the first time I read the Odyssey. I could not get over Odysseus's, what we would call, infidelity to Penelope, right? I just couldn't get past it. And on this read, it still troubles me. Actually, we're on book 19. I still don't know whether I like Odysseus or not. But on this one, what I really noticed is that Odysseus really appreciates Penelope's intellect, right? So the kind of the same relationship that Athena and Odysseus have, Odysseus really appreciates Penelope's intellect. She's beautiful, but you saw this with the Calypso narrative, where he rightly kind of holds himself back, but we've talked about in the podcast before that, Calypso's like, what does your wife have to me? And he's like, oh, you're an immortal goddess and she'll age and etc. But then he mentions like, my I can't remember what it says, my wise wife or my cunning wife. And then he very cunningly himself does not close that comparison with Calypso because he's stuck on her island, and that would be a negative. But we see that, I think, played out in this book with this dialogue back and forth. You kind of get this feeling that they're both crafting these answers, right? She's the matchless queen of cunning. And we kind of think that this conversation is very loaded.
He holds Penelope, to use a turn of a Greek phrase, he places her on a pedestal, I think, a good bit of the time. And part of that, I think, is due to their separation. They've been apart as time goes on. They both idealized each other a bit, I would say. But in this conversation, even as, he's spinning this tale about his false background or what have you, but always making himself still look really great.
Right.
It does strike me that it's Athena who sees all the sides of Odysseus, his treachery, his sneakiness, his ability to charm, especially to charm women or goddesses if needed. And Penelope may not have seen that side. He may be holding that back a little bit, although there does seem to be, in their encounter with each other here, I don't know, there's a current that does go between them, whether they're masquerading and this is a little bit of an elaborate drama. I don't know entirely. But you do get a glimpse of sort of the chemistry that exists between them, while not exactly the full emotional intimacy that you might expect of a husband and wife.
Yeah, there's a dance going on here. I think trying to discern exactly what the dance is part of the beauty of this Homeric text, because it starts off with, so Odysseus sends Telemachus to bed, which is kind of funny, right? He's playing that father role, so he sends Telemachus to bed.
Yeah.
Penelope again is, and we saw this in the last book, Penelope is again introduced, this is like, I don't know, line 55 or so, as she comes in from the chamber, right? So from this kind of intimate part of the home, right? She's coming out. And she is described as looking for all the world like Artemis or golden Aphrodite.
Yep.
And these two things are on opposite ends of the spectrum. So the whole book, and really I think in the Iliad too, we have been tracking that when Homer gives like one of these comparisons to the gods, it's usually not flippant, right? There's usually some reason this character is. It's really interesting that he borrows this from the last book when she comes out and all the suitors could see her too, and Odysseus. And, Artemis is this, virginal goddess that, like, much less touching her, if you even look at her inappropriately, like, you're going to suffer some horrific punishment, right? I mean, to touch her is death. And then Aphrodite is on the other end of the spectrum, right? She's this object of lust, right? And now we see in the Odyssey, right, she's an adulteress, right? She's, she's married to Hephaestus, but she's sleeping with Ares, right? And so it's really interesting that Homer presents her with these two different goddesses. These are two opposite ends of the spectrum, right? Is she either this virginal goddess that you can't touch, or is it she this object of desire? Which one is she? And I don't really remember throughout the book anyone else being introduced with two different gods, right? I don't remember. It's usually like, oh, it's like Ares or it's like Zeus.
Yeah.
But this one gives you a spectrum.
Yeah, it does. And it also is followed shortly thereafter just by this idea of how committed and loyal her ladies are to her, the women. She's appealing not just to the suitors and not just to Odysseus, but to the women. She's a compelling person. And it's interesting when the use of Artemis and Aphrodite almost maybe seeming to be one that would be appealing to women and one that would, like in the case of Aphrodite, be very appealing to men. But Homer wants us to know that this is a woman that when she walks into the room, everybody's aware.
No,
Even
I like
though
that
he also
reading.
describes her as reserved.
Right. Yeah, I mean, she commands the room whether or not she's actually speaking, right? When she just kind of comes out of this chamber. We saw that in the last book, like everyone just, becomes dumbfounded and looks at her and etc. So that's very good. Yeah, so we are, as you mentioned, we then are introduced to Melantho, one of her maidservants. And what we're kind of introduced to here is that, we found out, I think in the last book, we found out that Melantho is sleeping with Eurymachus, one of the suitors, right? And one of the questions then is like, how is this infidelity kind of bringing disorder into the home overall, right? Because her with Eurymachus, just even from like Homer's standpoint, right? Like the suitors are devouring the house, right? They're in violation of guest friendship, and for one of his own servants to go and sleep with them, right, is kind of a betrayal of him. It's a betrayal of the home. And it's interesting then, like this has been going on for so long that the maidservants now have like, I mean, even how they treat a guest. This is what Odysseus is, right? He's testing their guest friendship. They treat him very poorly. And then even how they treat Penelope and how Penelope turns around and treats them, right?
Yeah. It's interesting. One thing, not just in this book, but really even preceding it, this entire quandary that Penelope's in with the suitors seems to me, I don't know, to be a fruit of her own ambivalence. I mean, she's somewhat ambivalent. And I think ambivalence can sometimes draw chaos and disorder. She yearns for her husband and grieves him on the one hand, but she's being kind of pushed to maybe think about marrying. So she seems to be putting something out to the suitors that says, I could be persuaded.
Right.
And I think it's interesting, and maybe this is just the teacher in me, Deacon, I can't escape it. But I often think how when a teacher is ambivalent in a classroom, it can end up mismanaged and disordered. I always used to tell my new teachers, the first week, you've got to establish authority and order and routines. And that's really what you want to focus on in the first week. Because if you don't establish it then, it's very hard to do it later. And it just seems to me that this long separation from her husband, her own magnetism in some ways, and then whatever this ambivalence is, where she's not necessarily providing a strong moral center, and we have this act of infidelity around her, and now these suitors that are becoming increasingly out of control. It's just interesting. I've watched that play out with her.
Yeah, it's one of those watershed deals because we have a couple guys so I have a Sunday Great Books that comes over once a month and reads, and like some of them can't get past this, right? They're like, no, this is really kind of Penelope's fault. Like she's dragging this on, like the house being in disorder, the chaos, right? Really is her fault. And in a certain way, I view it as analogous to the situation with Telemachus, right? So Telemachus is suffering from a fatherlessness, right? He's a boy who lacks a father, and because of that, there's disorder, right? And he's kind of deprived of the maturation that he should have as a young man. So he has to go off on his own little odyssey. And I view it kind of similarly with Penelope is, to what degree can she even order the house, right? Does she have like a role to? And some people, I'm not sure the suitors have a whole lot of people that are sympathetic to them. But the question has been asked, like, she's the one not making the decision to marry. She has no idea whether Odysseus is coming back yet. Like, how long can she like drag this out? I think it's a good question. And I think the other question too that I had too, particularly on my second read, is like, where is Laertes?
Right. I thought I had the same thought.
Like, why is he just like out there wallowing underneath the trees out on like the family farm? Like, why is he not, in here doing something? I mean, I realize that Homer kind of gives this like broad thing of like, well, he's kind of depressed, he's sucking in grief, and without Odysseus, right? It's another thing without Odysseus.
Right. He's the center. Yes.
Right. Yeah. Odysseus is the center. So no, I think there's a lot of questions here that I think can get ferreted out about where does a disorder come from, right? And I think that's a really good point. So Penelope and Odysseus kind of begin their dialogue. And, if we just kind of sketch this as a whole, maybe, she asks Odysseus, which is now because of guest friendship, right? He's been feasted in the home. He's been welcomed. So now the question is like, okay, who are you? Where are your parents? Right now we've got to the point where the guest has to reciprocate. Like, okay, here's my story. What I really noticed is Odysseus' first answer is a complete non-answer. He doesn't tell her anything, right? He doesn't tell her anything about the story. He's basically like, oh, well, I won't bother you with this. He kind of compliments himself in a certain way, which is a funny thread throughout this whole conversation of like talking about how wonderful the king is. Notice too how many of his speeches start off calling Penelope the wife of Odysseus. He keeps reminding her that she's the wife of Odysseus, right? And Penelope then, the thing that kind of haunts me throughout all this is, what does Penelope actually know? Because we've seen that even though Odysseus is wearing a disguise, And his disguise is not that he went out and rolled in the dirt, right, and put on rags. Like, this is something from Athena, so it's apparently good. But we also see that it fluctuates. So when he's fighting the beggar, all of a sudden he does look like, like a warrior. And the people who know him and know Odysseus seem to be the ones that can perceive through the disguise the most. And he clearly, as we'll see in this book, clearly keeps some of the marks of who he is. And he looks like Odysseus. So one of the things that I always struggle with this is, how much does Penelope actually know? Because he gives her a non-answer, and Penelope just opens up, right? So here's this matchless queen of cunning who's usually incredibly reserved. Here's a beggar in your home, and she just opens up with everything that's going on. I mean, where do you see this dance between them on what they actually know about each other?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. I'm not sure how much she sees past the disguise per se, except that it does seem that despite having numerous suitors attempting to get her attention, nobody's really listened to her. And there is something in this demeanor. And of course, he's her husband. He knows in a way how to get to her, how to calm her or what have you. And I think she's feeling heard in a sense for the first time. Somebody's here that can't want something from me. I mean, assuming that she's not seeing past the disguise. This is a beggar. He can't,
right. He's at least not a suitor.
He's not a suitor. He can't expect.
He wants something, but he's not a suitor.
That's
right?
correct. Yeah,
no, I like that. I like that. Has anyone actually listened to Penelope?
Right.
That's a good question. I like that. So is she almost eager to tell her story to someone? And you actually see later when Odysseus talks about that he wants one of the old maids to wash his feet, not one of the younger women, which is a question I have. Yeah. Penelope responds back that she's never had a man so thoughtful in her house, right? And it's like 400 or so. She says, never has a man been so thoughtful. Of all the guests in my palace, come from foreign parts, been as welcome as you. So that's interesting. I like that there's someone now here who is hospitable to her and is listening to her, and that kind of prompts her to open up. Because the matchless queen of cunning, right? You kind of think that she's going to be more guarded than this.
Right. But you also see, as the portrait of the household emerges, and she has this chaos around her. She has a young boy who needs a father. You can see that concern of hers. She knows that he is very vulnerable because he isn't a full-grown man, and there isn't somebody there to help him do that. And I think there's a lot of woes and worries in Penelope's life, and very few people. And I think part of it's because, you hear this a lot. She is compelling. She's probably very beautiful, and certainly commands a room. And there's an assumption that people make around people like that, which is, oh, she's great. What does she need? And she may in fact be evincing a loneliness that, despite all the people around her, hasn't really been.
No, I like that. Do you know what I'm afraid of here? There's a line in Dante's Dante's Inferno. And when they enter the second circle of hell, which is lust, Dante the pilgrim is talking to a couple down there. And the woman is telling Dante the pilgrim about how they fell into lust and why their souls are condemned here. But she basically weaves this tale that, they're still in love, right? They're still here. And you see a bunch of commentators will mark on this, like, well, see, she's actually conquered hell. Right, her love endures. And one of the great commentators on the Divine Comedy, Musa, points out that all these commentators have been seduced by the woman, just like Dante the Pilgrim was seduced by. They fall for the same lies. Like the commentators fall for the lies of the character in the book. Yeah, right. And it's this deep irony, and that's actually what I'm afraid of when I read this. Right, is that like I can't figure out if Penelope's like opening up because she's vulnerable, or that she is spinning. Right, she's spinning something in what she wants to seem as vulnerable, and she's getting Odysseus, to open up and return. And so I'm trying to figure out. There's this dance here, right, of like where do we see Penelope?
Yep.
So they go back and forth. Odysseus does finally, I mean, it does work to a certain degree, right? She opens up to him. He then, quote unquote, opens up, which then he kind of tells this whole falsehood. Actually, Homer says on like 235, falsehoods all, but he gave her falsehoods all the ring of truth, right? Which he's very good about doing.
Yeah.
I've noticed he has a habit of adopting personas from Troy, right? So if he can adopt a persona from Troy, he's got enough real stuff to pull from to spin some lie. So then she tests him, and of course he's going to pass this test because it's like, what was Odysseus wearing when you met him when he left, Ithaca or whatever? And it's like, oh well, he's wearing this, which Odysseus is clearly going to know. But again, what is Penelope actually like, testing here? He at line 300. He reiterates that opening line he says all the time, noble wife of Laertes, right, son of Odysseus, right? He keeps reminding her that she's right, the wife of Odysseus. And then he tells her, like, oh, by the way, not only did I see Odysseus then, but by the way, Odysseus is coming back, right? He's going to come back and, etc. And this is at line like 350. He swears by, he says, I swear by Zeus, the first, the greatest god, by Odysseus's hearth, where I have come for help. All will come to pass as I say it, etc. And one thing I noticed here is that, obviously I don't think we can go through a single book without talking about guest friendship, right? I mean, it's ubiquitous in the entire Odyssey. Mm-hmm. But as we move to the end of the Odyssey, one of the things that we've noted is characters making oaths off of hospitality, right? That the host's table can be something so sacred that you can make an oath off of it, right? So Odysseus, I think, does this in the swineherd's hut. One of the prophets will do it based off the hospitality they're receiving inside the home. Here, though, he does it in the hearth, which is a little different, right? It's more intimate inside the home. It's not the chamber, right? So I was trying to think about where are we like on intimacy of the palace. It's not the main hall, right, where they're like sitting at a table and it's like, okay, here you go. The hearth seems to be this middle ground of intimacy. The chamber would probably be the most intimate. And he's making this oath with Penelope based off the hearth of hospitality, which is really then his own home.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about that, but I think that sounds right. And it's interesting that he can tap into that feeling. And again, he's very masterful. He knows her, so he knows how to make her feel connected and to feel welcome. He may know that that's an area that is of a particular import to her. I do always appreciate. I just love some of his, as he's talking about himself, reminding her that she is the son of Odysseus, and who could blame you for grieving your husband? And any woman would mourn the bridegroom she's lost, lain within love and born as children. Even though he was no Odysseus, a man like a god, they say. There's just something about those little comic lines, and you do wonder, is he saying this to a woman who is winking back at him like, yeah, I know who you are? Or is he, is it just swelling her heart even more with love for this husband? Anyway, I just bring that up because I think it's one of the more humorous parts.
Yeah, no, I very much agree with you, because one thing that Homer has given us is that when you run into two people, really man and woman, who both have these high intellects and have this like wit, we saw that this is why Nausicaa, right, the princess, was such a temptation to Odysseus, because she basically presented herself as a young Penelope. She was very witty and could match him, right, on these back and forths. And you had to read their dialogues 2 or 3 times because there's a lot that's not being said between them, right, because they're operating on this high level. And that's why I'm so suspicious about these conversations with Penelope, because, right, she is this matchless queen of cunning. And so, they had these kind of dialogues before, right? That walking around the palace, they have this wit back and forth, right, and this appreciation for each other. So when he's saying these things, I agree with you. You almost want to feel like Penelope's winking back at you or back at him, right? Just because she would be so used to his Odyssean rhetoric, right?
Exactly.
And roll her eyes and know the games that are being played, right?
That's right.
So the dialogue continues. One thing that caught my attention was at like 380 or so. This is Penelope speaking. She says, our lives are much too brief. If a man is cruel by nature, cruel in action, the mortal world will call down curses on his head while he is alive, and all will mock his memory after death. But then if a man is kind by nature, kind in action, his guests will carry his fame across the earth, and people will all praise him from the heart. The two things I noticed here is that, she's saying this to a man who just labored for almost 10 years because of a curse, right? Because he actually went and raided someone else's home and got caught, and then had this moment of pride at the end of where he actually said his name, and the Cyclops calls down this curse. So it's interesting that she's talking about these men that if you are cruel, you get cursed, which is what her husband actually is still trying to resolve, right? Even at this moment. And then, two, we go back to guest friendship, that a guest friendship done well brings fame and glory, right? That your guests will carry his fame across the earth. Because in the Iliad, which is, a lot of people contextualize as the book of war, and the Odyssey is the book of peace, it's interesting that in the Iliad, it's like, well, how do you gain fame? This kleos, this glory. Well, you have your Aristeia. You go off and you slaughter half the army and kill someone, and that's these military exploits. How do you do that in times of peace? Like, what is your glory and fame in times of peace? And here, she seems to say, well, being a good host is one of them. Like Nestor feeding the, what was it, 4,800, 4,500 people on the beaches, right? Menelaus was a great host as well to Telemachus. Like, this is how your glory and fame goes across the earth in peacetime.
Right. That's right. You would be known. And there would be, certainly other travelers, that concept of receiving the weather beaten, as she calls those, and being found to be kind, of course, then that's exactly what I think is a little bit of an insight into like a Homeric culture, almost. It makes me think of like during the Great Depression, when hobos would go from house to house, and there would be chalked symbols to let them know whether the dweller was kind or not. But there is something to that. In times where people are a little more desperate and reliant on each other. So it does seem to speak to that. Although I'm not entirely sure how true that would be. I feel like, people's deeds live on, good and bad, good and evil, afterward. And certainly Homer's demonstrated that in other parts of this book.
Correct. Yeah. So then we get, so the conversation kind of winds down. And again, so this is the host, this is Penelope showing that hospitality. And so Odysseus is going to be taken care of, which includes then his feet being washed. Yeah. It's interesting that he then says, of all the women who serve in your household here, not one will touch my feet, unless perhaps there is some old retainer, the soul of trust, someone who's borne as much as I have borne. I wouldn't mind if she would touch my feet. This whole conversation with Eurycleia I find fascinating, but why he does this, I think, is a question I have. And the best answer I could come up with is, one, he already knows Eurycleia, and he I don't know if he trusts her. I think he's more inclined to trust her. I'm not sure if Odysseus trusts anyone. But also, he's also seeing that there's a huge problem with the young maidservants in the house. And I don't think he wants to be with them. I don't think he wants to be associated with them, etc. Right? So he's like, nope, I don't need anyone's help, except maybe if there's this old woman, which he already knows, right? It's a question he already knows an answer to. So, of course, she presents, Eurycleia. And we get a fascinating narrative here where Eurycleia does go down. She's washing his feet, if you will, which is more than just his feet, right? She's basically bathing him. And before she even finishes or even really starts, Eurycleia has already told him that he's like Odysseus come to life, right? And this is, again, the people that are very intimate with Odysseus the disguise seems very thin. They seem, and this is why, again, how does Eurycleia, the old maid, perceive this immediately, and Penelope doesn't? That juxtaposition, I think, is intentional.
Yep.
And then obviously we get this famous narrative of, she's washing him, and she sees his scar, right? She touched him, and she sees the scar. And in a flash, this is like 4:45 or so. In a flash, she knew the scar, and we get this very long narrative that basically tells us that Odysseus had been skewered by a boar. It also, though, tells us where Odysseus' name comes from, which I think is important, right? That he's going to be the son of pain, which is great, right? I'm sure he, appreciated that. Yeah. Son of pain, and a name he'll earn in full. It's great. It's wonderful. Any thoughts though on Eurycleia finding him by his scar?
Yeah. I as I read that, I felt that Odysseus might be trying to force a connection with Eurycleia, who he knows from childhood, and there's a bond there. I think you're right. I think he wouldn't trust any of the newer people in the household. So, in a sense, it's an interesting thing too. When you're gone from a place for 10 years and you come back, a lot's changed, and I think he was trying to find a connection with someone that he felt he could trust. Although, like you, I'm not sure fully, but or conversely, someone he might be able to use to further, his retrenchment as the king of the palace.
Yeah, because he's intentionally, we heard that at the beginning of the book, right? He's intentionally wanting to test the servants. I think he's already written off the young maid servants. He knows what they're doing. He's tested Penelope. We're kind of figuring out where he thinks she is. And now he's testing like the old maid servant. This question, though, of the scar, there's a whole, I think I've talked about it on the podcast before, but there's a whole line of scholarship, and I'm not terribly familiar with it all, but there's a whole line of scholarship that basically points out that these stories of Odysseus, these kind of Homeric stories, would have been right in the background of the minds of the Hellenistic Greeks and Jews that would have heard the gospel. And there's a whole narrative that the gospel writers know this and basically present certain stories of Christ with these other stories in the background, right? About who is the true hero. I mean, it's really hard to read the story of Eurycleia and Odysseus' scar and not think of St. Thomas and our Lord, right?
Absolutely. Or even, Mary anointing the Lord's feet, that connection, that service that can be rendered, that, when it's rendered to Christ himself is an act of adoration, but it's so tender and it's such a human thing. It seems to me that there is a little bit of a connection. I also thought too, a couple times when we think about Penelope and her acceptance of him, and this sort of made me think of the Gospels and the gospel narrative. It seems to me that she, in all these years of missing her husband, has probably envisioned his return, and probably assumed it would be in a particular way, and he would appear to her in a particular way. And I'm wondering if none of this is what she would have had in mind. He would have to kind of sneak in like a beggar, and I thought about how difficult it was for some to see past. Is this not the carpenter's son? You're asking me to think about something, and I was expecting very different messianic visitation.
Like that. Yeah, the return of the king is not what we anticipated, right? With the Messiah. No, that tracks really well. I like that. I like that too, right? He comes in a more secretive way that you have to have certain eyes to see. Yeah, I think you could play a lot with that. Yeah, people also point to, there's these multiple narratives of Christ feeding the thousands, the Christ feeding the 5,000. There's another one I think where he feeds the 4,000.
Yep.
And a lot of people point to those with Nestor feeding the 4,500, 4,800, I can't remember, on the beaches when Telemachus shows up. And so there's these narratives that would have been in the back of these Hellenistic Jews and Greeks' minds when they're hearing now about the true hero, right? The true myth, right?
Yes.
So this is just it's a level of scholarship I'd like to look into more, of seeing how much of these narratives were kind of in the background of those hearing the gospel for the first time.
Yeah.
So Odysseus has a somewhat harsh response to Eurycleia, right? She might have been shown she was faithful a bit too much, because he also shows that not only did he know her growing up, she was his wet nurse.
Yes.
Right. She actually nursed him.
Yep.
So by the way, Eurycleia has got to be pretty old.
Pretty old.
So, basically he says, you need to be quiet or I'll kill you with all the other women in the house, which is a pretty direct statement.
Yeah.
And then Eurycleia even tries to help, right? Like, I'll give like a full report on like who's, good and who's bad of the women. And Odysseus, he tells her just to be quiet, keep your tales to yourself, leave the rest to the gods. And it's a harsh response, I think, on its face. I think the two things that come to mind is, one is that, he's really relying on Athena, right? Athena is going to tell him who's good and who's bad. And the goddess of wisdom, I mean, who's a better judge for him, to rely on? And two, I think throughout the Homeric text, we see a lot of focus on firsthand knowledge, right? Like, I need to know, right? Don't tell me who I can trust. Don't tell me what someone else saw of the gods. Don't tell me that, were you there? Right? This is like a big thing even when he's telling him a story, like, okay, well, you were actually at Troy, right? You were actually here. You actually saw the Cyclops. So I think in certain ways, that kind of epistemology endures, where it's like, okay, I need to test them. But really the daylight between Odysseus and Athena is not much.
No. And I would agree with you. I think that he often find Odysseus willing to connect with someone for a moment in time, for a very, finite purpose, but he has no interest in bringing her into the caper at all. For that, it's Athena, and she hadn't let him down yet. And so, yeah, I agree with you. It's funny. It is very disappointing, but he hasn't reached his objective yet. So sometimes, and you think about this, you think about, certainly in military stories, and even there have been times in the gospel where it's, Jesus himself sometimes has to rebuke people around him. He has not yet achieved the objective, and what they're asking or how they're pulling is not in that direction.
And this could be, no, I agree. I agree. It also occurs to me that this could be kind of a bookend, because at the beginning of the book, we had Eurycleia saying like, oh, I'll hold the lamp for you. And she's denied, and Athena plays that role, right? Of providing that light. And so here, I kind of like, I think you could read this as a bookend that like, so here she's saying, I could provide something to you. I could provide an insight. And she's denied. But she's denied because Athena's playing that role.
That's right.
I think that's a good way to read that. So the book ends with, again, I like your theory. I like your theory that, like, does Penelope need someone to open up to? Because again, I think this is a jarring narrative. Like, then she goes back to the beggar and she's like, by the way, could you interpret my dream?
Right.
And it's like, what are you doing? Like, what are you? Right. This is where I am afraid I'm getting sucked in, right? That she's actually playing a game.
Yeah, that she's telling him.
Right, that she's playing.
I know who you are, and I know why you're here, and I want you to know this came to me in a dream.
Yeah, because her questions are disproportionate. Of course, then like Odysseus is like, oh yeah, Odysseus is coming back. Like, that's clearly what your dream means. The only thing though that I think that you could put Penelope. Why I'm not terribly convinced that like she knows for sure, but there's a spectrum, I guess, that you could put her on, is that I just don't know how to settle that with like how the book ends, right? So it says, Penelope, once they reached the upper story, fell to weeping for Odysseus, her beloved husband. To watchful Athena sealed her eyes with welcome sleep. And I guess you could read that as, I don't know, because when I read it on its face, it makes it sound like she still misses him, right? Yeah. And so she's not convinced the beggar's him. But I guess you could read that as, she's weeping because he's home. I'm not sure if it gives us enough context maybe to understand which one it would be.
Yeah, I also, have, in reading their dialogue and looking at this dance that they're engaged in, it may simply be that she's found herself connected to this man, in a way that she hasn't felt in a very long time. And it, you can almost see, because he is her husband, she may not be able to see that behind the disguise. Then she goes to bed going, I'm still without my husband, even though I've had this connection. It's an interesting thing. It just tells us that, Penelope's very wounded by his absence. Yeah. And it's not going to be an easy thing for her, to move past either way.
Yeah, I think wounded is a key term there, right? There's that, you can read it in different ways, but there's that disorder in the house, and there's her own suffering that she's been going through, right? Her own life of pain that she's had. Her parents want her to marry. Laertes is out of the picture. Telemachus had to go out of the picture, and now he's kind of become a man. Like, she's had her own, definitely had her own pain that she's had to kind of suffer through. Well, anything else on book 19? Any other kind of highlights? I think you've really helped us kind of unpack the text.
No, but it's interesting. You gave me the choice, and I chose this one deliberately because I did love the the dimension and the energy of their reunion, even though it's not a fully realized reunion because identities haven't been completely revealed. But nevertheless, when they come together for the first time after the long absence, it's pretty it's a pretty gripping part of
It
the
is.
tale.
It is. It's wonderful to finally see them, face to face. And then, of course, it's really fitting that in these two masters of wit, we can't figure out whether they actually, recognize
That's right.
each other.
Exactly. Yeah. What's
Yeah.
interesting too, as I've read this thing, I'm almost amazed that there's never been any kind of movie treatment of this story.
Right.
Because it has some dimensions, I think, that would just, if you had the right actors to be able to convey that, that sort of ambiguity between them, that would be really fun to watch on screen.
It would be. It really would be. Well, we really appreciate you coming on and kind of helping us throughout the text and joining us for our Year of Homer. Where can people find you and find out more about your work?
Sure. At USCCB.org. If you look at the offices and committees, Committee on Catholic Education, you will see, our mandate and a lively roundtable discussion with our chairman, Bishop Thomas Daly, and Bishop James Conley of Lincoln. So I would invite anyone to check that out. And I hope to see people at upcoming conferences and as we continue to learn together.
Oh, very good. Well, Mary Pat Donoghue, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you, everyone, for joining us this week. And we'll be on book 20 next week. See you, everyone.